Okay, well, welcome to session 5. We're going to be dealing with Theseus primarily, but with a few comments generally around the Bronze Age heroes. And we've talked about Io and Europa, and I want to identify them as passive heroines or heroes because they did not intend what happened to them. They survived it, and as a result, great things happened. Nations were founded, but it was not by their intent. And so they are heroic in that they survived um, the events, but they were not intentional heroes. We're going to be dealing with several of the Bronze Age heroes who are active heroes who set out to do great things. And we'll be dealing with Jason at some point. And we'll be dealing tonight with Theseus, but we'll also deal in future sessions with Heracles and with Atalanta as active heroes. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and get started with Theseus. And I'll have side comments along the way. This is complicated enough that I've made a set of notes because, first of all, there's a lot to cover. And secondly, it's been a long time since I've done this. So uh, to aid me getting through it, I did put some notes together. And this begins with King Aegeus of Athens. He is the king and he's not coming up with an heir. So he goes to the Oracle Delphi to ask if he's going to have an heir. And the answer that he gets is as obscure as the oracles often make. He's simply told that he should not sleep with a woman until he gets back to Athens. And that proclamation alone should give us a heads up that something's going to happen before he gets back to Athens. So he stops in Corinth and he finds Medea there, and Medea has survived the Jason myth, and we'll talk about that when we deal with Jason. But she had to make an escape from Jason, and in Corinth, um, Aegis finds her and promises her safety, and so she is under his protection. He goes on to Troezen, um, where his friend King Pythias is, and he visits there. And Pythias wants a political alliance with Athens, and that is accomplished in those days primarily by marriage. Marriage very often was had nothing to do with love. It was, at least at the royal level, it was not about love or attraction between two individuals. It was a political arrangement for the most part. And so Aegis had been warned not to sleep with a woman, so he lets Pythias know that. Pythias decides to disregard that and plies Aegis with a great deal of wine until Aegis is fairly drunk, and then sends his daughter Aethra to take Aegis to his quarters. Well, of course, he winds up sleeping with her, and when he wakes up in the morning and realizes he slept with a woman and he is told not to by the oracle, he then tells Aethra that if a child comes from this, and if the child is a boy, that he will be the rightful heir to the throne of Athens. And so to facilitate that, he moves a giant boulder and puts a sword and sandals under the boulder and tells Aethra that when and if it is a boy, and when and if he grows old enough to and strong enough to move the boulder, that he should retrieve the sword and sandals and he come to Athens to be recognized as the rightful heir to the throne. Aethra is worried about, and of course she does have a child, and the child is Theseus. And Aethra is worried about um, the safety of Theseus as he's growing up. So she makes up a story that says that she was bathing in the sea and that she was raped by Poseidon, and that is the father of Theseus. So being having a god for a father would add a great deal of safety for Theseus. So he actually winds up claiming dual parentage. Um, so he does eventually grow big enough and strong enough to retrieve the sword and sandals, and his mother wants him to take the safe route to Athens, which would be by ship. But Theseus realizes he needs to get a reputation, needs some credentials in order to justify being a king. And so he decides to go overland. And it just so happens that that overland route has been taken over by thieves and brigands, and so it's a very dangerous route. And he decides that he's going to clean it up. And so he gets as far as Epidaurus and he runs into Periphetes or Periphetes. And Periphetes is a club wielding brigand and challenges Theseus to battle, and Theseus battle of clubs. And Theseus defeats Periphetes and keeps that club then with him as he travels on. The second one he runs into is Sinus. Now, Sinus is known as Pinebender, and what he did to dispatch his victims, and he would rob them, but he would bend two trees, pines, down and tie them off so there was a great deal of pressure there. And then he would tie one leg of the individual to each of the two trees and then cut the trees loose. So instant dissection. And and so he, in his effort to establish justice, decides to mete out the same penalty to each of these brigands that they exact of their victims. So he bends two pines and ties Sinus to it and tears him apart. The next event that he gets is actually an animal. There's a gray sow, a very large boar, female boar, that has been ravaging the lands. And so he decides he needs to rid the boar or rid the lands of the boar. And this is in the land of Chromion. And so he does, in fact, kill with the sword the gray sow of Chromion. The next one he runs into is a guy with a real attitude, ego issue, and his name is Skyron. And Skyron would rob his victims and take them to a cliff overlooking the sea, and then he would force them to bend and wash his feet. Now, in those days, washing someone's feet was the most humble task you could be asked to do, and you see that reflected in the Bible as well. So Skyron would have them wash his feet, and as they were washing his feet, he would kick them off the cliff to their death. We find something a little bit different about Theseus at this point because he does not require that ego feed, and so he simply picks up Skyron and throws him off the cliff. At Kerkyrion in Arcadia, he takes on a wrestler and he manages to defeat the wrestler Kerkyon of Arcadia and survives that. The last one that he runs into before he gets to Athens is Procrustes. And Procrustes has a bed, a metal bed that he lays his victims on. And if they're too long for the bed, he cuts off portions of their legs. And if they're short of the bed, it's a rack and he stretches them. Somebody always asks me, what if they're the right size? Well, he stretches them first and then cuts them off. So at any rate, he dispatches them that way. And Theseus does the same thing to him. We don't find out whether he was too short or too long. And I suspect he was probably too short because that sounds like a short person kind of activity to participate in. After doing all these deeds, killing all these brigands and the gray sow, etc., he decides he needs to purify himself. So he goes to the river Kephisos and he bathes in the river to wash away the um, var- uh, what he has done. And then he enters the gates of Athens. Now, before he gets there, his fame at all these different tasks he's performed is preceding him. And so the people of Athens know that there's this great hero coming. And and I've just been warned that my internet connection is not real stable. So if something happens, we'll deal
There,
with it.
there was a brief snag.
Okay. So his reputation has preceded him, and Medea, who's now taken up residence with King Aegeus, she's enjoying the I guess the convenience of being treated as the queen, even though he's not married to her. Aegis has not married her, so she's not really the queen, but she's living with him and enjoying a life. And we can understand when we get to the Jason myth, you'll understand why she is as vicious as she is about things. But she knows that Theseus is coming, and she's a witch, so she has the gift of prophecy and awareness, and so she knows that Theseus is in fact the son of Aegis, and that he will be the rightful heir to the throne. So she convinces Aegis that he is. She doesn't tell him about that it's his son. She says simply that it's this hero and that the people will want to make him king. So Aegis, who's getting older, is at risk of losing his kingdom. And so she convinces Aegis that they have to throw a grand feast for the hero when he comes, and that there she will poison his wine and they'll dispatch him. And so, sure enough, the feast is held, and one thing and another. Theseus then stands to make a proclamation, and he draws the sword that he retrieved from under the rock. And Aegeus recognizes the sword immediately, and as Theseus is holding the glass of wine and about to drink, Theseus knocks the glass out of his hand. Well, Medea has been found out. She makes a quick exit and she flies off to another adventure. So Theseus then has been reunited with his father Aegeus, and he still claims parentage of both Theseus or Aegeus and um, Poseidon. So at this point, Theseus finds out that the nephews of Aegeus have decided that the guy is too old and they're going to get rid of him. And so they're going to kill him. And so Theseus kills them. He kills the nephews, which would be probably his cousins. And then he goes to kill the bull of Marathon. And this bull is ravaging the land. And there's an event that leads up to this that we need to know about, and that is that King Minos sent his son to be made into a hero. And the kings did this. They sent their sons out of the country to some other king to be made a hero. And the reason they do that is it's very hard for someone to appear heroic if they're within the visible distance of the people of that land. So what they count on is they send them someplace else, and then as the story comes back about whatever adventure they're given, it expands and expands. And so by the time they do return home, they're well qualified to be the heir to the throne. Well, King Minos sends his son to Aegeus to be made great, and Aegeus sends him on a very significant event, which is to go kill the bull of Marathon, and he sends soldiers with him to help protect the son. But the bull tricks them and comes around from behind and kills Minos' son. So King Minos has lost his son, and he brings war against Athens. Um, and eventually they settle the dispute by Aegis agreeing to a punishment of sending 7 young men and 7 young maidens to Crete to be sacrificed to the Minotaur. And the Minotaur is a beast, half bull and half man, usually depicted as the bull's head on a man's shoulders, and the man's shoulders are very hairy and look beast-like. We need to understand where this bull comes from, so we're going to take, and all of this is wonderfully covered in books written by Mary Renaud, which include The King Must Die and The Bull from the Sea. And she gives a more plausible explanation for the mythological explanation or existence of the Minotaur, in that the Minotaur really is the son of another son of Minos, who wears a bull's head as a helmet, and so he appears to be this creature. Well, that may be, we don't know. We do know there was a Minotaur in the mythology, but the myth explains it by saying that Poseidon gave Minos a magnificent white bull and instructed him to sacrifice the bull to Poseidon. So this wasn't going to cost Minos anything. He's been given the bull, he just needs to sacrifice it to Poseidon and then everything will be cool. But the bull is so magnificent that Minos decides to substitute a bull of lesser quality and sacrifice that to Poseidon, which really ticks off Poseidon. So Poseidon arranges for um, Pasiphae, the wife of King Minos, to fall in love with the bull, the white bull. Now, this gets really sticky, and it's not a very pleasant kind of thing, but she wants to mate with the bull, and of course, it's a bull. So she goes to Daedalus, the great inventor and sculptor and a lot of things. He's kind of Leonardo da Vinci of the ancient Greeks. And she explains that she wants to mate with this bull, and Daedalus creates a wooden cow that she crawls inside of, and the bull mates with the wooden cow, and of course, impregnates Pasiphae. She gives birth then to the Minotaur, which is part man and part beast. Sometimes that's reflected in some mythology books, etc., as a bull's body with a man's head with horns. That's inaccurate. It is definitely, that would suggest an intelligence that the Minotaur does not have. So it has the head of a bull, and therefore animal and basically in nature. But it's very dangerous. And it also represents the shame of King Minos for not having sacrificed the bull and his wife falling in passion for the bull, etc. So he hires Daedalus to create a labyrinth, a maze under the palace, a maze so complex that anything introduced into it will never find its way out. And so Daedalus does that, and the Minotaur is introduced into the maze and, of course, is trapped there. Well, Minos has exacted this tribute from Athens of 7 young men, 7 maidens. Sometimes they say every year in the myth, sometimes they have other, like every 9 years. There's a number of different versions. And remember, I'll make the statement again that these myths are told by bards over a number of years, over different locations, and for different reasons. There's variations in these different myths. In the one that I'm working from right now, he's required to send 7 young maids and 7 young men to be sacrificed to the Minotaur every year. And so when Theseus now has been reunited with his father, he does not like this tribute that's being required. So he volunteers to be one of the 7 young men. And Aegis tries desperately to talk him out of it. He's just found out he's got a wonderful heroic son, and he doesn't want to lose him to the Minotaur. But Theseus becomes insistent, at which point Aegis says, "That's fine. Okay, here's the deal. I want to know that you've survived as soon as possible. So when the ship returns, change the black sails, which means sails are dirty, to white sails, in other words, clean sails, so that he can, when he sees the ship returning, if the sails are white, he'll know his son has survived. That's important and plays a role later. Theseus then goes with the seven young maidens and the other six men, and they go um, to Crete. And Minos comes on board the ship, and one of the girls is particularly attractive, and Minos tries to seduce her. And Theseus intercedes, and he says, "No, this isn't going to happen." And Minos says, "I am the son of Zeus." And all of a sudden, there's thunder and lightning. And he says, as proof that he's the son of Zeus. And Theseus says, "Well, I'm the son of Poseidon." So these are the two brothers of the Olympic kings, Olympic gods, and um, and so they're at a draw. Minos takes off a ring that he's wearing and he throws it into the sea. And he says, "Well, if you are the son of Poseidon, you'll be able to retrieve the ring." Theseus dives overboard and begins looking for the ring. And Poseidon's wife, Amphitrite, comes to his aid and helps him find the ring. He brings the ring up, gives it to King Minos, and so the young lady is spared Minos's attention. But these 14 people, the seven young men and seven maidens, are paraded through the streets of Knossos, where the palace is. And Minos's daughter Ariadne sees Theseus and twang arrows, or shoots an arrow of love through her, and she falls in love with Theseus. And she wants to do something to rescue him, so she goes quickly to Daedalus and says, and we find out how unsophisticated this whole thing is. She says, "How can Theseus, if he defeats the Minotaur, how can he find his way out of the labyrinth?" And Daedalus says, "Well, it's pretty simple. You just take a string and you unravel it on the way in, and you just follow the string out." Nobody had thought of that. And in the myth that I'm working from, she brings the ball of twine to Theseus and tells him that she has a way for him to get out of the labyrinth if he succeeds in killing the Minotaur. And but he has to promise to take her with him when he leaves because she's doing this in defiance of her father. Theseus agrees to that. And then the myth version that I'm talking about, she actually holds one end of the string as he unrolls the ball of string going in. He finds the Minotaur. And again, there's different versions here. In the version I'm dealing with, the Minotaur is asleep. And Theseus pounces upon the Minotaur and he beats it to death with his fists. As the Minotaur wakes up, of course, there's this battle. But it's important that we understand that he beats the Minotaur to death with his fists, an unsophisticated, non-war weapon. He doesn't have a sword. He doesn't have an advantage. He is using his raw strength to defeat this monster, which is symbolically representative of defeating the barbarity of this tribute. He then follows the string out, grabs Ariadne, makes his way to the ship, and they make their escape. He's sailing back toward Athens, and a strong wind comes up and blows them off course to the island of Naxos. And Naxos is sacred to the god Dionysus, the god of wine. And they happen to be blown there during the great festival of Dionysus, which is a celebration of the god that involves a lot of drinking and getting very inebriated, and primarily among the women of the cult. It's a cult, and the women get very drunk. They very often run into the forest and capture small animals and tear them apart. They do this symbolically representing the fact that Dionysus, who is the god of the vine, and therefore god of wine and grapes, that when the grapes are harvested, the god is symbolically torn apart. And so this god is one who, like Persephone, is associated with birth, death, and resurrection. So part of their ceremony then is to go into this religious fervor. It's always been difficult for me to understand how drunks could capture small animals, but apparently they do somehow. And Ariadne becomes inebriated with these, and she joins the cult. And Theseus is forced to leave without her. Now, there's another version of the myth where he goes to check on the ships because the storm is still blowing, and the ship that he checks is on gets blown away from the island, and he fights valiantly to get back. But by the time he gets there, she has died. Well, that doesn't hold water because Ariadne is found by Dionysus, and Dionysus marries her. And so she becomes Dionysus' wife. So obviously she's not dead. And um, so Theseus, at any rate, leaves the island of Naxos without Ariadne. And so much has happened since he left, he forgets to change the sails. And so as the ship comes onto the horizon, Aegis, who's been looking every day, going to the cliff above the sea and looking every day for the ship, sees the ship returning with the black sails and leaps off of the cliff to his death. Theseus gets back to Athens, finds out that his father committed suicide. He feels really bad about it, but there's nothing he can do at that point, and he assumes the rightful inheritance of the throne. Um, Switching here to another set of things. Um, he's now the king of Athens, and he begins making reforms. And he begins moving the city of Athens more toward a democracy. It's not completely democratic, but he starts um, laying the first levels of citizen involvement in the government. And he becomes very popular because of the reforms that he's made. And he also gets involved in doing adventures. He goes out and seeks adventure, and again, still trying to build the image of the rightful inheritance of the throne. Um, the Amazons, who are warrior women, come against Athens, Attica, and they do so because of an affront that occurred to them. And so we need to know a little bit about the Amazons. I don't think that I've covered them yet within the lectures here, but I'm going to deal with it a little bit. The Amazon Society is a female society. They only allow men into their community long enough to generate some more girls. Boy babies are killed, and then the men are killed. So, in most cases, though not all, because Jason and Argonauts uh, survive it. At any rate, these warrior women were very, very skilled warriors and very dedicated to the arts of war. According to some of the myths, the Amazons amputated the breast on their bowstring side so that they'd be better as archers. And that is a detail that some claim the name is associated with Amazon. At any rate, these Amazons then have suffered some kind of an affront, which we don't know exactly what it was, but they come against Attica, which is the area around Athens, and they are pretty successful in actually threatening Athens and the people of Attica withdrawn within the walls of Athens. And eventually, though, Theseus leads the warriors against the Amazons, and in so doing, in Greek mythology, warriors become very impressed with other warriors. And for instance, in the Trojan War that we'll be dealing with later, um, two very key adversaries, Hector and Achilles, fight to draw many times before Achilles gets really ticked and eventually takes out Hector. But they are so impressed with each other's um, military prowess that they exchange gifts. And one of them receives a dagger that has a magnificent golden dagger. And I don't remember all the things. We'll deal with that when we get to a Trojan War. But the situation here is that the queen of the Amazons is Hippolyta. And she is so impressed with Theseus that she falls in love with him. Now, in different versions of this myth, in some of these, Theseus abducts her, and others she stays willingly, and the Amazons go home, and she stays with Theseus. Either way, she winds up um, married to Theseus. Now, I should say that I kind of skipped over one thing. When Theseus loses um, Ariadne, he takes as his wife Phaedra, who's the sister of Ariadne, arranges that, takes his wife as a Phaedra. Well, Phaedra, they have a, or no, I'm sorry. This is a mixed thing. I've got to kind of be in two places at once. Um, because Phaedra actually comes later. So Theseus is with Hippolyta, and they have a child, a boy, a young man named Hippolytus, named after his mother. And Hippolyta now decides she needs to go back to being queen of Amazons, and so she leaves. And Theseus has this fine young son, Hippolytus, who's growing up to be magnificent. And he is one of these Greek men who will have nothing to do with women. That is common among some of the Greek heroes. Um, so Hippolytus is growing up and he's magnificent and he's a hunter and he's a lot of different things. This is when Theseus takes the wife of Phaedra, the sister of Ariadne. And Phaedra, by this time, Theseus is getting a little older. He's been on a lot of adventures and what have you. And Phaedra is young, very young. And so she's kind of getting tired of the old prune that she's married to. But his son Hippolytus looks pretty good to her. So she's trying to capture the attention of Hippolytus. And Hippolytus is not having anything to do with it. Not only doesn't want anything to do with a woman, he certainly doesn't want anything to do with his father's wife. She becomes more and more despondent, and while Theseus is away on one of his adventures, actually with King Pythias, for a wedding, where the centaurs get drunk and grab most of the women at the wedding and start to run off with them. That's stopped by Heracles. We'll deal with that later. At any rate, while Theseus is gone, Phaedra makes arrangements to meet with Hippolytus, and she comes on to him, and he says, "No, this isn't happening," and he uh, leaves for the time being. Becomes extremely despondent. Her servant says, "Well, you can probably get even with him by accusing him of raping you." And so she writes a note saying that she was assaulted by Hippolytus, which is totally untrue. And then she commits suicide. Theseus comes home, receives the note, and by virtue of the fact that she committed suicide, believes it's true. And this is something that most Greeks would not agree with because a man's word is never to be taken or never to be dismissed against a woman's word. So the fact that Theseus believed the note from Phaedra, even though she committed suicide, which seemed to be supportive of that, was unexcusable to the Greek people. And Theseus then condemns his son Hippolytus and sends him from the country. And Hippolytus has explained that he was innocent, he didn't do it, et cetera, but Theseus sends him away. Well, Hippolytus yokes up horses to his chariot and he's leaving the land going fast. And then a bull, a white bull, appears on the hill and scares the horses, and they veer off course, and the chariot rolls and crushes Hippolytus, and he's dying. And as most of the stories say, that Artemis then takes the crushed body to Theseus and explains to Theseus that he was very wrong to not accept his son's word that his son was innocent, and Hippolytus dies. At which point the people condemn Theseus and they send him away, and he winds up going to an island, and eventually he is killed by the king of that island. So that's kind of the run of it. But there's one section that I want to deal with specifically that I haven't told you yet, and that is the story of Pirithous. King Pirithous is becomes a sidekick of Theseus. Pirithous is one of these individuals who has wants to be a hero, and he's not good at it. Theseus has heroic adventures, and he's really good at it, and he's successful. Pirithous doesn't think things through. And so Pirithous decides he wants to meet Theseus. So one of the best ways he might be able to do that is to steal Theseus's cattle. So he steals the cattle of Theseus and is driving them away. He hasn't thought this through. And then he decides, well, Theseus is probably coming after the cattle. So he starts walking back and he meets Theseus and he says, hey, hi, Theseus, I'm Pirithous. I stole your cattle. Now, Theseus at this point looks at him and says, this guy is either dumber than a rock or he's the bravest man I've ever met. And so he decides to give him the benefit of a doubt, and they become fast friends. Theseus' cattle are returned to him, and Pirithous and Theseus become friends. Well, Pirithous and Theseus go on adventures. Theseus' adventures are always grand, they always work out, and everything's cool. Pirithous' adventures are always lame brain, and Theseus always winds up having to rescue Pirithous. So at this point, they each decide that Phaedra's dead, so Theseus doesn't have a wife, and they each decide that they need to have wives. So Theseus decides that he wants the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen. She is unfortunately at this point only 10 years old. And so they decide that they're going to go abduct her and wait for her to grow up and she can marry Theseus. So they do that. They go and steal Helen and bring her to Athens. And then Pirithous decides that for his wife, he wants Persephone, the wife of the king of the dead. And Theseus tries to talk him out of it, but he says, no, that's who I want. I'm going to go abduct her down in the underworld and abduct her. And Theseus says, well, this is insanity. You can't do that. Pirithous heads out, and Theseus is such a um, good friend that he can't let Pirithous do this by himself. So he goes down with him. And they go down into the underworld and they come to a rock, a boulder, and they sit down to rest for a minute. Only the rock turns out to be the chair of forgetfulness. And as soon as they sit on it, they both forget who they are and why they came, and they're stuck there. And they're stuck there for some time. And when we talk about Heracles, you'll hear about this particular part of the adventure. But Heracles is on another task, coming down into the underworld, and he sees his cousin Theseus, and says, cousin by virtue of the fact that Poseidon is supposedly one of the fathers of Theseus, and he decides he's going to rescue him. So he lifts Theseus off the rock, and Theseus then suddenly remembers who he is and why he came, etc. When Heracles goes to lift Pirithous off the rock, Hades says, no, you can have Theseus. He came as a true friend, and I respect that. So you can take Theseus. He can return to the upper world, but Pirithous stays. And Pirithous is there stuck in the chair of forgetfulness for all of eternity, although another version of the myth says that eventually Hades releases him from the rock, but by this time Pirithous has died. And so now he stays in the underworld by virtue of the fact that he's going to become a listless, gibbering ghost with all the other dead souls. And so that's kind of the end of that particular story. Theseus comes back up above, and as I explained before, goes through the things that we've already talked about. Theseus represents the Athenian hero. Athenian hero is an intelligent hero. Athens is the city of enlightenment, philosophy, music, drama, all those things very much were focused on Athens. So the hero, their primary Bronze Age hero, Theseus, had to be this intelligent individual who has these tasks that he solves by his use of not only strength, like Heracles uses strength, but Heracles is not the brightest crayon in the box. And Theseus, on the other hand, uses brains and brawn. And he represents the Athenian concept of a hero. And that carries over into later ages as well in terms of what Athens is about. So that's kind of the story of Theseus. And he is one of the major Bronze Age heroes. And we're going to be dealing again with Heracles later. And Heracles is even more complex than Theseus. In fact, the myths around Heracles grew to be so many that a proverb came among the Greek storytellers that said nothing without Heracles. And Heracles began to be involved in every myth that was being told somehow. He was included. Sometimes with just a cameo, walk-on appearance, but he was to be included. And then Atalanta, we're going to be dealing with Atalanta, and she is the one female active hero heroine, and we'll talk about that at some extent because it represents a great deal to do with the complexity, the Greek thinking around the role of the genders, and it's a complex thing that existed in those ancient times. So that's kind of basically what I had figured for tonight, and we have a limited crowd. Thank you both, Brian and Chance for sitting through all of this. But at this point, do you have any questions or comments that you'd like to toss in here?
Not really.
Okay. All right. Well, I am going to end this then, or end the recording. So you guys hang on. I'm going to stop the recording and then we'll talk for a minute. And meeting